Hey everybody, it's Steve. We're here in my studio. This is exciting. I got a great friend on the call today. His name is Dr. Thomas Zampieri, and we're going to talk a little bit about a few things related to the Blinded Veterans Association, and vets, blind vets, and visually impaired vets, specifically maybe veterans and service members that have lost their sight in war, and for me, when I lost my sight 10 plus years ago, it was something that seemed very surreal. And as a young soldier, hard charging, just wanting to serve in the Army, I really wasn't familiar with what would happen if I was hurt or wounded. What that whole process was. And Tom is very knowledgeable in that area, and he's worked with many people in Washington, D.C., fighting for different things for veterans and service members, especially research related to traumatic eye injury and many other things. And so I'm really happy to have him on the show today. And we have some videos and some different things we're going to share. But how are you doing, Tom?
Very good. And good morning, and thank you, Steve, for inviting me to be on the show.
Where are you calling in from? Texas?
Oh, yes. I'm here in Houston, Texas. It's where I live now, in about 10 miles south of Houston.
Yeah. So Tom, I was reading through your bio a little bit, and you were active duty for a while and up to staff sergeant, and was a medic, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I was Vietnam era veteran. I served on active duty from September 1972 to September 1975, and was an Army medic during that time period for the 3 years. And then when I got out of the service, I used my GI Bill back then and went to college and got a degree as a physician assistant and graduated in 1978. And so I went back into the Army National Guard and actually spent 21 plus years in the active National Guard.
As an officer?
Yeah, and was during that time, 15 of those years, I was actually an Army flight surgeon. I was the battalion medical officer for different types of aviation units.
So for our listeners and viewers, just real quickly, like a flight surgeon, what's their responsibility?
Great question, by the way. The flight surgeons are responsible for all the medical evaluations of the pilots and the crew chiefs and all of the flight personnel in the battalion, so I'm not actually, people hear the term surgeon and they think, but
Tom, you cutting people up?
Yeah. Yeah. And you're actually instead you're providing general medical care.
Yes.
But your principal function is to determine whether or not the pilots and crews are able to fly. And so, you do a yearly physical on them and check everything that you'd normally do in a physical exam, eyesight and hearing and all those kinds of things, and a lot of neurological tests to make sure that they've got their, coordination skills and stuff. And then what's also required as a flight surgeon is a certain number of hours each month. I actually had to go out and fly with the pilots. And so the concept, whether it's the Air Force or Navy or Army, if you're a flight surgeon, whatever aircraft that you're assigned to, you got to spend time with them and flying in those aircraft. So, Air Force flight surgeons or friends of mine spend time going out and flying in Air Force jets. And Navy got, and so I spent time though either Blackhawks or Hueys, going way back to the 1980s. I spent a lot of time with
Saved my life, a Blackhawk. I don't think I'd be here today if I wasn't airlifted. So
and so I had about 600 hours of flight time by the time I got out.
So do you own a helicopter, Tom?
I wish.
I wish too, because I'd come down there more often.
I don't know if I fly with Tom.
And so,
is your mic on, Vic?
Yeah, it's far away.
Everything sound good?
Yeah, I think so. Is Tom in the picture pretty good?
Yeah. You're when you're looking up, especially Tom can definitely see you. And then
just want to make sure you're sitting in the picture right for the viewers.
It sounds like all the audio is good on Facebook, loud and
cool.
clear.
Yeah, Tom sounds good. I don't know if he's too low or not. I can hear him really well. So hopefully the viewers and listeners can.
All right.
So Tom, sorry to interrupt, but you were at my bedside. You were one of the first individuals I met who was blind or visually impaired, and I've known you now, almost 11 years, and it was because of the Blinded Veterans Association. You were at the time, if I'm not mistaken, the legislative director, correct?
Correct. You're right.
And you were bringing people into the hospital to meet with some of the veterans that were there that had lost their sight, and you were providing them with knowledge and information about what the next step would be, and I really cherish that and remember that to this day, and that's why I'm involved with the BVA, the Blinded Veterans Association. And so what we're talking about today, the stuff that you provided that we're going to show to the world about World War I, about the beginnings of what blind rehabilitation really was, I think is quite fascinating. And that's why in the beginning, and as a modern warrior, from this day and age, someone that's been, injured or wounded or hurt on the battlefield, coming back, like that process, and then reintegrating into society, and how does that all happen? And maybe work into what you gave Vic and I, so we can present that to the public.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And so you mentioned I started working for BVA as their director of government relations in April of 2005. And coincidentally, my wife, who had deployed to in 2003, she went over to Iraq for 6 months with a medical unit, by the way.
Yeah.
As a captain.
Wow.
And so
it's in the family to help people.
So when I moved to Washington, D.C., kind of fast forward, the connection with Walter Reed was she got hired in 2005 in the spring when we got there, and she worked on the trauma floor initially for the first couple years.
Yep.
And then she switched and worked in urology surgical service for the last 7.5 years that we were there. And so initially she would come home and tell me that there were blind service members coming in from Iraq, and there was no one that went in to talk to them about what to expect. And she said there's Vietnam vets that are coming in and talking to the amputees about their life and their recovery and using prosthetic legs or prosthetic arms. And so, of course, with my medical background, I said, well, do you think the hospital will let me come in and visit with those soldiers or Marines that are coming in with eyesight injuries? And so I went out and met with the chief of orthopedics, to this day, who's a good friend of mine, Colonel Paul Pasquini.
Uh-huh.
And he said, absolutely, you got to do this.
It's important,
Yeah, there's nobody else coming in to talk to these individuals about what to expect after they've lost their eyesight.
I really think that it made a huge difference in my in my transition and mental health at the time, and understanding that there was this option, for rehab and learning how to be independent. And so I'm very appreciative to it, that you fought to, I don't know if it was a fight. Was it a fight to try to speak?
More, not so much at Walter Reed. In fact, it for 6 months, it was a little weird because there were some concerns, among some of the medical staff.
HEPA, what is that called?
Yeah, the HEPA thing. And also, as you can appreciate, they tried to be careful about, there was a lot of public interest in the returning wounded.
Yeah.
And they wanted to restrict visitors to either family members or if fellow unit members wanted to come and visit, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then suddenly, Tom Zampieri shows up, and I said, I want to do peer support.
Yeah.
And then again, I didn't create the idea. The Vietnam, I had two good friends actually who were Vietnam War amputees that were doing those kinds of peer support visits with the amputee patients. And I just said, this just, and again, the chief of orthopedics, I went down, met with the chief of ophthalmology, and fast forward, pretty soon, people just send me an email or call me and say there's another new patient that's come in from Longstuhl, Germany.
So Tom, to give some people some perspective, I thought, and I maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, when I came back from the theater of war in like that May of 2008, I was only maybe one of 90 or 100 maybe completely war blinded in the coalition too. The whole is that right to say? I guess that number seems small to me, but on the scheme of things, I'm not entirely sure. But there were a lot of eye disorders or injuries from both sides of the spectrum, to eye penetrating, traumatic brain injury, and many other things, just dust in the eyes. But thousands, 30 plus, right, or more maybe. But right. But back then when I came back, I think I was only one of a few, just 100 or so, and that includes like Australia, the UK, British that had come back.
You came back when the casualty count was still sort of growing. And at that point, there had been about 100 that were blind. But there were 16% of all of the wounded that were evacuated from either Iraq or Afghanistan, though, had sustained some sort of penetrating eye injuries. And so the numbers are actually high, but due to advances in surgery and advances in the ability of ophthalmologists to treat eye injuries, there were fewer that ended up blind.
Well, I want to say something about that, because people often think about, amputees and people paralyzed, which is horrendous, horrible injuries. But the eye is such a delicate organ, and when you're on a battlefield where helicopters are taking off and there are artillery rounds detonating and IEDs, your eyes are super fragile, and so to really think about it in the scheme of things, it's you can easily suffer some sort of eyesight injuries.
And exactly. And so since we're in this area, I'm also the guy that used to testify in front of Congress on behalf of the Blind Veterans Association. And so I got very good at statistics. And what that 16%, by the way, turned into is by 2012, there were 4,798 penetrating eye injuries that had been evacuated. So there's 200 that are blind, legally blind, meaning that their vision uncorrected is 2200 or worse.
The acuity, yeah.
Yeah, their visual acuity. And so, so it's about 200 out of that, basically 5,000 that sustained some sort of penetrating blast eye injuries. And again, 80% of all wounded evacuated from the two theaters were from IEDs.
Yeah.
And what was unusual about these two wars is the fact that if you look at previous wars, going back to the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and even Vietnam, the causes of eye injuries were varied. Gunshots, actual, other types of facial injuries caused by munitions, hand grenades, those kinds of things. But these were IEDs or some form of IEDs.
Yeah, improvised explosive devices.
Yeah. And so so the numbers there have actually continued to grow also because of the blast effect traumatic brain injuries that cause vision disorders. And today in the VA, there's 39,000 with traumatic brain injury diagnosis with the some type of vision disorder.
Yeah.
And so it's a stunning number.
It is a stunning number.
In what we're concerned about, the Blind Veterans Association, and since we kind of got into this, we advocate for Department of Defense research for both the management of penetrating eye injuries, but also new ways to diagnose traumatic brain injuries, whether it's mild or moderate, so that you can then, if you can diagnose it early enough, then the next step is being able to treat with either medications or something else to prevent the cascade of changes that occur. And so
it's a scary thing in the sense of the brain injuries. I think some people don't realize or understand that if you hit your head hard enough, your retinas can detach, and even just succession after these injuries that some of the soldiers and warriors sustain on the ground, like being exposed to consistent blast pressures and stuff can really cause damage to the brain, which is not, I think, fully understood completely, but I mean, some of our friends, Tom, have lost sight after they returned from war. They noticed diminishing sight loss.
Right. In fact, Eric Martz is a good example. Sergeant Major Eric Martz, our friend up in South Dakota.
Yeah. He has a radio show.
Yeah, has his radio station, by the way. We give a plug for Eric.
Yeah.
He sustained, I think, around 20 concussions, blast concussions. And so he was never sent home. He came back with his unit, but his vision symptoms were getting worse. Mm-hmm. And they gradually got worse. And then Scott Carruthers, who's an Army National Guard medic with the Vermont Combat Engineer Unit, from my meeting returning wounded, Scott probably unfortunately holds the record of documented 28 blast concussions. And Scott went blind over about a 2.5 year period after he came back. And so there's and this could be a different show for you, but there's a lot of interest in this also because of what's going on in the National Football League with repeated concussions. in traumatic brain injuries among veterans from blasts, even though they're mild concussions.
Oh yeah.
There's a similarity between the NFL and National Hockey League players,
and even NASCAR. I was listening to something about Dale Earnhardt, and other people. I mean, they do have a lot of sophisticated equipment to help reduce things, but if they, depending on the angle of attack and the crash and the energy that is transferred into the body, can really have. And so I've been researching some doctors that are out there that have worked with some of these people, and maybe I'll reach out to them and try to get them on the show. You can help me, Tom.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah. One of the things we could do with this is, there's people that I could easily introduce you to that would be probably glad to be on the show in the future.
I would love to have them.
That are internationally known experts. And by the way, in England, the blind veterans, the UK, they're dealing with the same thing. And over there, though, of course, there's no football, but soccer concussions,
or rugby maybe,
are resulting in rugby. Players have the same kinds of repeat concussions that cause problems, neurological problems, and vision problems.
Yeah.
And so we work together on that kind of thing.
No, it's a good thing. I mean, and I'm glad that we can have this kind of conversation, because a lot of times we have these conversations, Tom, amongst the blind veteran community and other people that we know, but it's not always blasted out to the public in a way that can keep people informed or aware. And that's a big goal for me and this show, is to have all kinds of people on from different parts of life and with different experiences. But close to me is visual disorders or blindness and what's happened. So you brought Vic was you and I were talking about World War I, and did you want to jump into that? Start talking, or do you have something else you'd like to add?
No, I think what we can do is probably a good segue, because I touched on that, Blinded Veterans Association started in World War II,
yes,
in March 28th, actually 1945, and I guess my peer visits at Walter Reed are similar to why BVA was founded in World War II. There was about 118 war-blinded Army service members that were at Old Avon Farms, Connecticut, which was a rehabilitation hospital. And probably no different than when I walked in your room, these guys all got together and said, that we got to do more and create continuous rehabilitation services for veterans.
Yeah.
And so what is interesting here is you go back to World War I, the eye injured that were blind were evacuated out of France, and they were brought back to a Army General Hospital number 7, which was outside of Baltimore.
And you gave some photographs maybe or something of that? I don't know if there is, because Vic can show those too.
So I actually just popped one up, the mustard gas blinded evacuation, where there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. There's at least 12 just in the photo itself of some soldiers they've got their hands on the shoulder in front of the soldier in front of them. They've got it looks like bandages on their eyes. And isn't there I thought I saw a statue of this somewhere.
Yeah. And actually the Blind Veterans UK, their rehabilitation center up in Wales at Loudnow they have a bronze statue inside the rehab center of the World War I blinded veterans. Yeah, and it's amazing. And then
you're showing these to the public, right, Vic?
Yes, and
picture.
I just actually that's where I saw that photo from.
Yeah.
It was in your slideshow, and I just popped that one up there.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Yeah.
and then so they came back through by ship, obviously, and we entered World War I officially June of 1917. So we're at the end of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I was last November on Veterans Day. And so what most Americans may not think about with World War I is our engagement as far as sending troops didn't really start until June of 1917, and the war ended November 11th, the famous,
the 11th hour of the 11th day.
Yeah, 11th hour. And but we had about 4 million served in the military, but 1.2 million deployed over to actually fight in Europe. And we had over 118,000 that were killed in action. And so what's stunning about that is roughly in less than 19 months, we lost more people in World War I than we did the entire 9 years of the Vietnam War and the 3 years of the Korean War combined.
It's horrible conditions.
Horrible. And the staggering numbers in World War I in September and October of 1918, literally just a couple months before the war ended, we had 21,000 killed in 1 month.
It was the invention of these these weapons that could like the Maxim machine guns and even tanks existed then in a primitive way, and of course artillery bombardment was just horrific on a horrific scale. If anybody's ever looked at or have talked to about it or have researched it, the farm agriculture, it was just things were decimated.
Oh yeah, and so it was the first quote industrialized war in World War I, and exactly the cannons that we think of from the Civil War, for example, that had limited range. Suddenly in World War I, you had long-range artillery that could literally lob shells 20 miles.
They'd rain down on positions.
And they just rained down. And there's several British famous war stories about, some of the battles where as many as 1 million shells, artillery rounds, hit within a week of the trenches.
And that's why it was trench warfare. People didn't want to be out and about because, people, for the listeners that have never been around an explosion, there's just tremendous amounts of energy. You don't have to be hit by a fragment to be killed or severely wounded. Organs can rupture, and it's very powerful. The feel of a blast, concussive wave, So.
And so anyway, the Army War Department designated the Army General Hospital No. 7 up in Baltimore would be the official one hospital where all war blinded would go to, and they actually based that, by the way, on military medical officers visited what was known as St. Dunstan's in London in World War I.
Yeah.
And they observed the training that they provided to their the British war blinded that started in 1915.
Yep.
And so by the time we engaged, again, it was 1917. And so the military ophthalmologist went and visited St. Dunstan's, and they said, what do you do for your training? And they did actually similar things to what we do today as far as manual skills. In other words, they tried to train people, though, with a concept that was relatively new at that time, that we want to prepare these individuals to go back to work.
Yeah.
So they would train them to like do pottery and or be a piano tuner or a bookbinder or even sewing and those kinds of things.
Yeah, working with your hands.
With the idea that after they left the hospital, they would be able to go get a job, and therefore feel like they were independent and contributing to society.
Yeah.
And so they didn't do though the training that the new veterans get, learning household things, cooking,
living skills.
The living skills. They didn't do that. It was more focused on initial orientation, being able to. There's a famous. I don't have a picture of it in my slide presentation there, but there's a. They carved for the hospital for the patients. They carved in wood tactile of all the rooms, and so like where a veteran who is blind could feel, okay, I go down this hallway and I'll end up in the cafeteria in this part of the hospital.
Reference points and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was just at the blind school there in Texas, the Texas School for the Blind, and they still utilize that technique. They have, like, for the bathroom, there's raindrop style stuff on a piece of wood. They had it right on it's kind of interesting. That's or a waterfall, like flow of water. It feels like that, and that's just tactile reference. So when people are moving down the hallway, that's where I am.
And so they officially opened and it became known as Evergreen. And so any of the listeners who want, if you go to, you can literally type in Evergreen General Hospital World War I, and you'll go to a website that has all kinds of pictures and stuff.
Google that.
The state of Maryland actually has a historic museum still there. After the war ended, fast forward a little bit, in 1921, the American Red Cross took over Evergreen, and they continued to treat veterans for another couple of years until that hospital closed. And this is where things went bad. As you know, younger veterans now, or whether it's World War II or Korea or Vietnam veterans, the VA system, the rehabilitation centers have been in place since World War II. Yes. So you can go back for additional training. Mm-hmm. Well, what was bad planning was when they closed it in 1924. From that point to World War II, there was nothing.
Yeah.
Except you could go, if you were lucky enough to be close to maybe some states had agencies for the blind, but their training was minimal.
Yeah.
And also back then, transportation, of course, if you lived in rural areas, it was tremendously difficult to get to a city where they might have some kind of services. And so there was no continuous training available. So the World War I veterans went home. Essentially, there were about 800 of them that were blind, as far as what we can tell from some congressional records between the War Department and the Bureau of Veterans Affairs. Back then, the Veterans Administration.
It's hard to track those numbers.
Yeah. And so, but they were paying disability compensation in 1926 to about 800 um, blinded World War I veterans. And by the way, they got $49 a month, which I was stunned.
I don't know how that would do that today.
Yeah.
Here's your $49 for losing your sight.
And what was amazing was I found the congressional legislation where it was 1924, they increased it because originally it was only $17 a month. And so if you came back in 1919 and you went through the training and you were discharged, you got $19 a month if you were war blinded.
Wow.
And yeah. And so there was this fantastic relief quote when Congress raised it to $49 a month in 1926 or whatever the year was, and by those standards back then, I guess you could say that was a lot of money.
It was,
because
yeah.
People would get work all day for $1.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, the history where it sort of fell off was the disconnect was there was no other follow-up after, and all the other military hospitals pretty much closed down in the 1920s. Like most wars historically, after the war's end, there's a big downsizing.
Yeah, it's a drawdown. Yep.
Yeah, and the same thing happened. Military bases closed. The number of active duty forces dropped dramatically.
Yeah, you lose all that. You lose all that knowledge and all that information that was gained.
And then and then the other sad thing that happened to the World War I veterans was, of course, we all know the 1929 stock market crash and the start of the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
So millions of people were thrown out of work. Well, you can imagine all these World War I veterans who had been taught these types of, I guess you could say, technical skills, piano tuning, book binding, those kinds of things. Well, there were no jobs because all the small companies folded. There was massive unemployment. And so we fast forward to the start of World War II. Roosevelt knew that we were going to end up, in World War II. And the military did, and they started planning in 1942. In 1943, what are we going to do with returning war blinded?
Mm-hmm.
And so they did the same thing. They designated 2 hospitals, one out in California and one in Valley Forge, to be the two military training rehabilitation hospitals for the blind. The one in California near Palo Alto mostly had Marines and Navy personnel from the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And the one at Valley Forge had huge numbers of Army, mostly, and Marines from Europe that were evacuated back to Valley Forge. And so a little different there because the United States was much larger by World War II, and the military realized that they were going to be fighting 2 different theaters, so they needed 2 different rehabilitation hospitals.
And today there's 13, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And one of those is in Puerto Rico, and the other here within the lower 48 states.
Correct. And Hines, of course, was the first blind rehabilitation center that officially opened.
Edward Hines Jr. VA Hospital in the Maywood, Illinois area, Chicago area.
Yeah.
That's where I went through my blind rehab. I'm hoping to have Denise on here. I was talking to her a little bit. So.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
That would be a great interview. And So there was a lot about World War I. We touched on different things, but basically, when you look at the PowerPoint that I sent, there's more numbers, and there's some great photos of the soldiers that were getting training. and that you can incorporate into this.
Absolutely. I'm sure Vic has been showing some of it.
Yeah, I've been popping through some of your slides with the numbers and the.
You're definitely switching over though on the ATIM, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
There's one thing though, Tom, that we've been to St. Dunstan's, which is BVUK, I guess now is the proper name for the Blinded Veterans United Kingdom group, and one thing to say about our fellow Brits across the pond. It's all charity, right? There's no Veterans Administration per se.
In fact, I'm glad you touched on that. That was one of the first things that amazed me when we first started. Our Blind Veterans Association started Project Gemini exchanges in May of 2011 with the blind veterans of the UK, and they received no government money, but they've treated their war blinded going back to World War One. And so for us over here, it's like, well, the federal government has an obligation to provide the rehabilitation services, and over there, they're a nonprofit charity. And they started, ironically, there's another coincidence. They started March 26th, 1915.
Wow.
And BVA started World War II up at, again, Avon Farms, Connecticut, March 28th, 1945.
Interesting.
So they're 104 years old now, and we're 74 years old.
What amazed me, though, was that they have a bar in their blind center. Where will you find a bar in a Veterans Administration hospital?
when I've taken doctors and researchers over to England to spend a week with us, Project Gemini, they've been fascinated by that.
Went to pint.
Yes, having a pub inside your rehab center. There's been at least 4 Army colonels and Air Force colonels that I've taken over to spend a week, and they've all come back and strongly urged the Defense Department.
Oh, it's great having fish and chips in the bar and a pint of beer,
And for some strange reason, the higher command authorities are not impressed with the idea, but
it's culturally different.
And the British, it is amazing, and the exchange program each year was actually started with the idea of us going over and learning about their rehabilitation center,
Project Gemini. Which is and I've spoken to Colin. He already said he's going to come on the show, so I'm going to get him on here. So
all right, and so I won't steal their thunder. Then, but,
well, you can say a little bit.
And getting back to World War One and World War II, both wars. As I researched it, it was amazing because in both wars, the surgeon generals at the time for the military sent colonels, ophthalmologists, over to visit what was then St. Dunstan's to learn. And so in World War II, they were reinventing everything.
Yeah.
And Colonel Vail, who was the Army ophthalmologist, who's the chief consultant to the Surgeon General, it was fascinating because after his first and original trip to visit St. Dunstan's and to make policy recommendations about how we're going to set up everything here in the United States for our war-blinded service members, is just kind of a interesting side story here briefly. He told a sergeant, a staff sergeant, he said, you need to find out what happened to the World War I blind. Mm-hmm. And so they somehow had about 380 names and addresses.
Wow.
And so the colonel ordered this sergeant. He said, in 6 weeks, I want you to go visit. I want you to go visit these guys and come
6
back.
weeks.
Tell me what you found. And
Yes, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Again, we're not talking about the jet age. We're talking about back then, the only way you could get from one city to another was by train.
Yeah.
And the trains weren't, high-speed trains either back then, and so this guy literally left Washington, D.C., and he went up to Pennsylvania, and he went over to Ohio, and I've actually got the cities that somewhere where he visited.
Oh, wow.
In
this presentation that you got here?
The sad thing was, and that's not in my slides.
Oh, okay.
But 330 of them, if I remember roughly, were in state veterans nursing homes, even though they weren't very old.
Yeah.
And what had happened was, back then, their parents had either passed away, and so you would have a 40-year-old who was blinded in World War I, who was unemployed in the 1930s, and there was no place for them to live. And so they ended up in these state veterans homes and extremely depressed and isolated, and again, no opportunity for further training.
Yeah.
And so when this staff sergeant got back and he reported to Colonel Vail, it sent shockwaves.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
we
can't allow this to happen again, where we have all these individuals that are still relatively young, that are in these homes that have, 80-year-olds, and it just was wrong.
So horrible thing.
And so it was Staff Sergeant Hoover, by the way, that was given that illustrious assignment.
Assignment, yeah.
And having served in the military, any listeners can imagine being called in by the colonel and told, you're going to go find these 380 people, and you're going to be back here in 6 weeks. And you walk out with a train ticket terminal, saying, "Oh, this is not going to be fun." Where are you? I got to go to Cleveland, Ohio. Are you? Yeah.
Well, it's
Augusta, Georgia, and these were far-flung
spread
places.
Out.
Yeah, and
you're just finding these individuals, and only the conversation you probably that went on.
Hi, I'm from the Army. I'm here to find out how you're doing.
I was looking for you, but I couldn't see you. So.
Yeah.
No, it's really.
Some of the typical soldiers' responses would probably be, what took you so long?
Exactly.
I've been here since
I've been waiting.
1929, and you're the first person from the military to come visit me. But
I can't.
Anyway, so there's all sorts of connections with BVA and us, and the St. Dunstan's in World War II. I would say, and Colin will touch on this with if you interview him probably, but one of the things that impressed me was in 1944 they treated, and they have photos of American war blinded from France that the St. Dunstan's actually kept them.
Yeah.
And treated them, and they were there for a couple months, going through the same training that the British blinded soldiers were going through. But the St. Dunstan's staff felt so strongly about that, we don't want to put these guys on a ship and they go back to the United States and they may not be able to get access to training.
Yeah.
And so there's that connection, and so we and then from from now to today, as you mentioned, there's 12 VA blind centers in the United States and one in Puerto Rico. And things are a lot different as far as there's the VIST system, which are like the case managers.
Yeah, that refer
for blind veterans, and so lessons learned sometimes over history. But anyway, there's a good start for I guess a show. I didn't ask you, how long do you?
Oh well, we go as long as we want. But I think we've. How long have we been going?
You're at about 50 minutes.
50 minutes. Okay, I mean, it's a good. That's a good time. I mean, I'll go as long as you have something you want to specifically talk about. I'll once I say bye to you, man, I'll play some of these other videos, and say some closing words. But this is interesting stuff for some, I'm sure, because people have asked me over the years, different questions about the process, and people don't, blind rehab is like a school, and I mean, you learn everything from CATS, computer access training. I think systems is the acronym, and living skills, and all these different things that are related to being independent and managing your day and your life. And it's important for these systems to exist, both in the civilian sector and in for veterans and service members, especially if they're war blinded or injured overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is good. You may, like when I've been on Eric's show, and I guess you've been on his show.
Yeah.
Usually it's about 25 to 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm. We can go 3 hours.
But that includes, he has to insert the advertising. So his show's actually almost, I think
it's produced almost.
Yeah.
This is fluid. This is we're live right now. I don't know how many people are watching on Facebook. So
you got a little different ball game. In this. You don't have to insert commercials into the middle of like every 5 minutes or. 10 minutes.
This is an actual video that's being recorded, and I'm taking the audio as well. And I'm going to make a podcast, and I can. Incorporate in those files and re-upload them to the internet for indefinite amount of time. People can view them, and they will have the sponsorships, advertisements, those kinds of things.
Yeah. And eventually, where I'm headed, I think, is the same as what you just said. Though you probably want to have specific time, the interviews, the interview part. Like with Eric, is probably adds up about 32, 34 minutes. Mm-hmm. And then you hopefully will be successful someday and actually have some advertisers that at the beginning of your show and then towards the end of the show, you'll throw in. And
I may do some more produced shows. But I plan on having a long-form conversation kind of like this. I mean, this was a mix of interview, I guess, and discussion and conversation. Because it's nice because things can come up, that we think about in the moment.
Yeah. So I'm going to run.
Okay, Tom.
And then what we'll do is let me check with. I mentioned the Caregiver magazine people, Gary.
Yeah,
he wants us to do one just sort of specific to BVA.
Uh-huh.
So maybe what we can do, like I said, is I want to find out though. That's a question. I don't know how long his podcasts are normally.
Well, we can tell him right now on the air. What's his name? Maybe he'll listen to this. I don't know.
Gary. Well, I'm thinking that, if he says, we could do one of two things. It'd be harder for Victor, but, suppose he says his average podcast is 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You could take probably a lot of this, cut and paste it, and put together a podcast.
Oh, yeah.
But it may be actually easier for us to just do one just specific to the BVA, the history of BVA. Use that a couple of these introductory segments that you found on YouTube.
Yeah.
And send it to him, and then he's got a nice 30-minute podcast on BVA that he can use.
No, most definitely.
Whichever's easiest.
Oh, well, the sky's the limit. I mean, we can do a little bit of all that. We can experiment. I might get you some headphones next time, because I think I'm bleeding through into your speakers, into your microphone. But you sound pretty good to me. I hope everybody else thought you sounded good.
I hope so. This has really worked well. I mean, my microphone investment was worthwhile.
Absolutely.
And then, so this was a good test run, and like I said, you can play around with this thing, just something else to work with, and we can circle. And then in the future, as I told you, if I can get, Colonel Rob Mazzoli, the National Director of Eye Trauma Education for the Vision Center Excellence, would probably love to be on your show. I'd love to have them.
I don't know if they will be, but I would have them, definitely. And maybe I'll get some generals on here. No, But Tom, it was great to have you on the show, and I really thank you again for sharing some information with the public. We'll do it again.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And you guys have a good day, and I'll go back to pestering people in Washington, D.C.
Okay, Vic, maybe you should hang up. Yeah.
All right.
And then I'll try to click off here.
Yeah, we'll hang up. Thanks, Tom. You take care.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed Tom. Tom's an interesting guy. He's a good guy. Maybe, Vic, if you get back to your spot, we could play that BVA video that's on YouTube. For the Blinded Veterans Association. This is like an introduction.
Chartered by the U.S. Congress in 1958, the Blinded Veterans Association has continuously been a strong voice for the nation's blinded veterans. The BVA is proud to take responsibility in assisting blinded veterans and their families in returning to their rightful place in the community by providing them useful information and practical help.
The Blinded Veterans Association was founded by approximately 100 war-blinded veterans from World War II. They believed that there should be an organization of blinded veterans.
The Blinded Veterans Association was established specifically to promote the welfare of blinded veterans by providing answers and resources to help them deal with the discouragement and frustration they often face. By working closely with the Department of Veterans Affairs, BVA assures that all blinded veterans have access to excellent blind rehabilitation training, technology, and counseling. The BVA has field representatives that live and work in 7 regions across the country, providing inspiration, encouragement, and guidance through the entire benefit claims process. Because they themselves are blinded veterans who have been through similar experiences, they understand the complexities and emotions behind the process.
Field representatives play a critical part of being able to provide information to blinded veterans on what benefits they're entitled to.
If you or someone you know is a blind or visually impaired veteran, call 1-800-669-7079 or write to Blinded Veterans Association,
outdated.
477 H Street Northwest, Washington, D.C.
Is it back on me?
Back on you.
Yeah, no, so again, everybody, thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions, please feel to reach out on at steve@baskis360.com. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and my Twitter feed. Like I said in some of the statements in the posts I've made on social media, we'll be more consistent in February, and I'll have more and more people on the show like Tom and maybe not so many blind vets. I'll have to expand on the people that I'm talking to. No, but thanks again, and Vic, since this is new, we're messing around with our graphics at the end. You can just play that, and then at the end of that, just end the show right when it's done playing.